So I think we are all ready to kick off the webinar here today. And so I would like to, on behalf of the Global Compact Network Denmark, welcome everyone. We'll be talking to Mr. Paul Polman today about the concept of net positive. And this very interesting overarching question in your new book, is the world better off because your business is in it? So my name is Lene Serpa. I'm Director and Head of Corporate Sustainability and ESG at AP Møller Mærsk. I'm Chair of the Board in the Global Compact Network Denmark. And I'm very excited to be moderating today's conversation. So just a few practical notes for the participants before we get started. Please note you can post questions in the Q&A function. There's no possibility to speak, but write it in the Q&A function, and we'll see. We hope we can get to some of these questions towards the end of the session. Also, a note that this conversation is being recorded, and this recording will be shared with everyone afterwards. So with that done, I'd like to move on to introducing our special guest today. For those of you who are not familiar with Paul Polman and his work, and I'm sure most of you on this call already are, but would just like to highlight that Paul is described by the Financial Times as a standout CEO of the last decade. He works to accelerate action by business to tackle climate change and inequality. He is and has been for many years a leading proponent that business should be a force for good. He was CEO of Unilever from 2009 to 2019. And in this capacity, he demonstrated that a long-term multi-stakeholder model goes hand in hand with financial performance. He was a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel, which developed the Sustainable Development Goals. And he continues to champion these goals, working with global organizations across industries to push the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. He chairs Imagine, which is a social venture dedicated to systems change, Said Business School. He is vice chair of the UN Global Compact and a B team leader. He is the honorary chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, which he led for 2 years. So this was a very long introduction of all your great accomplishments, Paul, but I haven't even got to the most important in this respect, which is your new book, Net Positive. And this is a call to arms. We understand, we'd love to hear more about that, to courageous business leaders setting out how to build net positive companies which profit by fixing the world's problems rather than creating them. So a very warm welcome to you, Paul. And I would like to jump straight into some of the first questions, if that's okay. About your book. So tell us, why did you choose to write this book? Why do you see the net positive message as so important now?
So before I do that, Lene, let me just thank you for obviously taking on the chair of the UN Global Compact in Denmark. With Sarah, you're a strong team, and what I saw was, although you just started in 2017, you're 500 members strong already, and quite some impressive companies there. And it doesn't surprise me. Lisa Kingo, who was before Sanda, the global director of the Global Compact, was obviously Danish. But in the many things I do in life, I see a lot of Danish footprint or handprint, whatever you want to call it. You might say, can a small country make a big difference? And I would say yes. And you're doing that continuously in most of your companies. How often I've used Maersk, that you represent, setting in your industry, but still, after all, is a high abatement industry, net zero goals for 2040, or making sustainable airline fuel goals for 2030, putting scope 3 in there as well is quite quite courageous. And I want to thank you for that, because by doing so, you change your industry well beyond that. But then you have the Novo Nordics or the Legos or the Ørsteds, and the list goes on. Sometimes I feel if the whole world would be Danish, we wouldn't be in the challenge, we wouldn't have to deal with the challenges that we see today. So perhaps to some extent, I'm preaching to the converted, but I apologize for that. But here is the issue. What we're trying to do is the book, and I'll tell you why. We want to reframe what good looks like. We want to do that by driving a movement. We are very practical with our book, focusing on the how. We're not navel-gazing the problem. We see it as enormous opportunities, and you'll recognize if you read the book the very positive tone. We put some principles in there of what net positive companies could or should look like. But above all, we make it clear that you cannot have company transformations or systems transformations if you don't have the personal leadership transformation. So it's a very comprehensive book, and has been well received by the people that have read it, at least. So the world is 4.6 billion years old. And these, if I put it on the scale of 46 years, human beings have only been around for 4 hours. The Industrial Revolution started 1 minute ago. And in that 1 minute, we've cut down half the world's forests. This year, World Overshoot Day was July 28th, which is the day that we use up more resources than the world can replenish. I would argue that after that day, every day after, we're actually stealing from future generations. We're living well beyond the planetary boundaries. And we're starting to see the effects of that. Mother Nature is sending us the invoices. One of them being COVID itself, a zoonotic disease like SARS, Ebola, Zika, Asian flu, and the list goes on. Probably 3 or 4 waiting around the corner. And the cost that we're incurring increasingly of our failures to live in harmony with Mother Nature, to live in harmony with future generations, is actually enormous. COVID alone cost us $17 trillion in Europe and the US to save lives and livelihoods. Infinitely more, I would argue, than if we would have worked together to solve the problems in the first place. When you have a country like Pakistan, and it's not an exception anymore, where 1/3 of the country is underwater, over 35 million people displaced right now, and many thousands losing their lives. You see the high cost of our failures. And the list goes on. I don't really need to tell you that. In the last 5 decades, we've lost 68% of the world's mammals, birds, species, reptiles, and so it goes. Hubert Reeves, who is a philosopher in Canada, said it very well when he said that man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. So if you go to the COP26 in Glasgow, where I was for 10 days, or if you go to the sustainability reports of the companies that are issuing it, and these are probably the best in-class companies issuing them in the first place, you find that most of the commitments deal with being less bad, Lene. Less carbon in the atmosphere, less plastics in the oceans, less deforestation in the value chain. But if things have overshot the planetary boundaries to such an extent, less bad is simply not good enough anymore. I used to murder 10 people, now I murder 5 people. Am I a better murderer? It just doesn't work that way. So we need to get people to shift their mindsets, not even being net zero or being sustainable, as people call it, which is neither good nor bad. Applaudable as it may be, it isn't enough. The only thing that really will help us if we think restorative, regenerative, reparative, and that is what we call net positive. And for us, the hallmarks of a net positive company are obviously the courageous leaders that we can talk later. But the main hallmarks, if you want to, is take first and foremost responsibility of the total impact in the world. All consequences, intended or not. Facebook might be a very useful company for many, but if it also doesn't take responsibility for child addiction, undermining democracy, hate speech, it is not doing its job properly, and you've seen the consequences of that. Many companies still think they can outsource their value chain and also outsource their responsibilities. That doesn't work anymore. The second characteristic of a net positive company is that they work for the long-term benefit of both business and society. If you want to solve these issues of food security or climate change or inequality, It requires a longer term approach. And then automatically it brings you to all stakeholders, not just a myopic focus on the shareholders. So these companies, as a third point, try to strive to have a good return for all of the stakeholders. In fact, they see the shareholder return as a result of what they do, not as a myopic objective. With Maersk, you have an advantage that it's a family-controlled business, but if you're a publicly traded company, then often they dance to the tunes of the shareholder, and that's not really that useful anymore in today's environment. And then last but not least, these net positive companies, they forge the broader partnership between the different parts of society to really drive the broader systems changes that are needed. We're currently trying to optimize all of us within a system that frankly isn't designed to deliver anymore. And not surprisingly, we're not getting the results. So how do we drive these broader systems changes together to tackle these really tougher problems? And that's for us an important part of leadership of net positive companies.
Right. So I think that's also what is really exciting about your book, is that it does set forth this very sort of positive, aspirational vision, right? Rather than, as you say, being driven by being less bad or reducing something which is framed as negative, but then actually being able to work together towards a positive outcome. And I think you already mentioned some of those core characteristics. What would be your advice to businesses to get started with embedding such frameworks within their organizations? Yeah. Where do they begin?
Well, Nelson Mandela said it always seems impossible until it is done. It's overwhelming. We have the changes that need to happen at the scale of, well beyond the scale, I would argue, of the Industrial Revolution, and they need to happen at a speed well beyond the technological revolution. And CEOs have to juggle everything. There's a geopolitical crisis, there's a health crisis, there's a trust crisis, there's a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, and I could go on and on and on. And it's very difficult within all of that to get your arms across and around it. And most people are trying to stay alive, running around in the forest versus having the time and capability to work on the forest. So the three stages that we discuss in our book, and obviously we go into much more detail, is it starts with yourself and the personal transformation. I'll get into that. Then you work your own house. You cannot get the trust or be trustworthy if you don't have your own house in order. So you have to earn a seat at the table, as I call it. Then we talk about the broader transformations needed that you can drive. First, in your industry, 1 + 1 is 11, a whole chapter dedicated to that. And then also with civil society and government, which we call it takes 3 to tango. So the first thing that you have to start with, like in anything, is what we would call unlocking the company's soul. And you cannot be a purposeful company if you're not purposeful yourself, just like you can't have a sustainable company if you're not sustainable yourself. I would argue you cannot love others if you don't love yourself. So it starts with listening, it starts with awareness, it starts with understanding what is going on out there. So many companies are inside out. You have to have an approach of what I would call outside in. And that starts with yourself. Rumi, who was a 13th century poet, said it very well when he said, "Yesterday I was smart, I wanted to change the world, but today I am wise, I'm changing myself." So that is really where it starts. And the first chapter in the book, we spend a lot of time on that and say, do you really care? And this is important because if you can develop your own personal purpose, then collectively you can develop the company purpose. And that purpose gives you courage, actually courage to do much more than the mediocrity that we are all collectively doing right now. So the second part of the strategy is of implementation is, if you have this covered your purpose and you put it at the core of your business, then you need to make it also the cornerstone of your corporate strategy. This is not a sideshow. Sustainability and multi-stakeholder needs to be at the core of the strategy to such an extent that all employees write themselves in the story. And it starts with an honest appraisal where you are. At Unilever, we looked at our total impact in the value chain and measured the impacts on the variables that counted for us at that time. be it water, be it climate change, be it waste, be it human rights, whatever you want to, and map that. And that is a very important thing. Then, because you have the courage and you have mapped where you can make the biggest influence, you move to the third step. We call it in our book, blowing up our boundaries. And many companies set targets not to lose versus targets to win. Many set commitments that they know they can already achieve. They're frankly not ambitious.
Yeah.
Many make commitments to, we plan to be net zero by 2050. I don't know what net zero means, and none of us is going to be here in 2050. What are the real plans that we're doing between now and 2030? What are the targets we need to set that science needs, that science tells us we need? So doing that, setting these targets, building an open book, building trust, inviting other people in is a very important thing. Then you get to the fourth step, which are in fact these broader partnerships. In Unilever, when we put these targets out there, we felt uncomfortable. We didn't know how to achieve it. And we made it very clear that we couldn't do it alone. It actually created that human level, that confidence, that ability to attract others to help us achieve these targets. And that's a very important thing. If you look at what you, for example, have done with Yara or with H&M, where you are partnering together to create a fossil fuel-free supply chain. No company can do that alone. Just like Unilever can't get rid of the issues of plastics in the ocean or deforestation. And then the final part, which for us is very important, is really if you want to build that trust, if you really want to implement it, get the maximum out of these partnerships, you need to be consistent. It is surprising still how we cherry pick and celebrate, but then undermine it with other things we do. For example, we might have very aggressive climate goals, but as we've seen in the US, many of these companies then belong to trade associations that lobby something else. How do we deal with issues of tax? A quarter of the Fortune 500 companies don't pay tax. I don't think, you can really be a purposeful company over time if you don't pay tax. That's part of the thing you need to make our system function. How do you deal with human rights? How do you deal with money in politics, as we've seen with the dreadful events in January 6 in the US last year? So these are the tougher questions of consistency that need to be handled also. But ultimately, it's the same change process that I think business is very capable of doing and implementing in so many other things. Right. And the beauty of it is the world is changing so fast around us that there are enough signals out there that I think help us change, not least the employees who work for us that are well aware of the need for all of us to be more responsible in the way we go to market with our products.
Exactly. And I think that's also personally one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book is that you also address these the elephants in the room, right? Those big, tough issues, which, as you say, you have to incorporate that as well, right? This is not just about picking the easy wins in any way, right?
This is about the harder rights versus the easier wrongs. That's how I would.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent way of putting it. Yeah. So, so when we, and I think we'll get to some of the participant questions in a second, but just before we do that, I mean, so overall, when you look at the future, and of course you've outlined some of these enormous challenges that we're facing, and let's say the imperative also of business to leaders to step up and be courageous on these topics. But are you then overall, you optimistic or pessimistic looking into the future?
Oh, I'm what I call a prisoner of hope. If you have a choice between an optimist and a pessimist, always take the optimist, because you likely have the same life, but you have a happier life than a pessimist. And frankly, anytime you get into these negative thoughts and become pessimistic, it doesn't really lead to anything. So I've already decided a long time ago not to participate in that game. Nor do you want to be naively optimistic. You have to be a realistic optimist. So that's why I deliberately use the word being a prisoner of hope. And the reason I'm hopeful is that by any measures, study after study still confirms, for example, that we can stay below 1.5 degrees, that we have it within our power, increasingly becoming more attractive actually to solve these issues. The reasons for that, I think, why that is the case increasingly so is the speed of technology. You know that where, for example, you're a heavily fuel-based industry, but the way that the methanols or the biofuels or the ethanols are developing in terms of fuel, we will soon be hydrogen. We'll soon be in a position, I think, to even tackle the toughest challenges.
Yes.
And some of these high abatement industries are already there. We've seen the same with solar and wind. In 2014, the International Energy Agency, I still remember, was saying solar and wind would be 5 cents per kilowatt hour by 2050. We achieved that in 2020, 30 years earlier. Now it's 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour already. Technology always goes faster. The second reason I'm optimistic is the cost of not acting is now becoming higher than the cost of acting. Anywhere you look, frankly, we are familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, obviously, which is really at the heart of the UN Global Compact. But I would argue that for every individual goal, we already incur costs that are higher than what it takes to implement all of the goals. Now, that's quite a statement. But our global food system is currently costing us $11.5 trillion in negative externalities, basically by cutting biodiversity, keeping smallholders farmers poor, the carbon emissions associated or the water usage with these systems. We could actually turn it around by making it a regenerative or what you might call sustainable agricultural system. It actually gives a $4 trillion benefit. These are big swings. Goal number 16 on the Sustainable Development Goals is peace and justice. It deals with rule of laws, absence of wars. You know that this global world spends 10 to 12% of its total economy on conflict prevention and wars. That's 3 to 4 times more than what we need incrementally to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. We rather pay a lot of money to deal with the outcomes of us not acting than to avoid the issues in the first place. It's outright stupid. So the companies that understand that is an easy territory. You think you might lose competitive advantage, that it doesn't always marry with profits, that there might be different stakeholders you have to deal with, that there might be lag effects between investments and returns. It is not difficult, not easy. We understand that. But the companies that lead, we see increasingly in that area are doing better. We can now see that companies that more progressively, more actively attack these negative externalities are actually already higher valued by the market. So what people call immateriality is rapidly becoming material. And the third and final reason why I'm optimistic is frankly the young. I was last week at One Young World in Manchester. I actually chair it. 2,500 of the most brilliant, purpose-driven young people in the world coming together from all over the world. A Ukrainian youth embracing a Russian youth, a Palestinian youth embracing an Israeli youth. They are laughing about the childish games that our politicians play. They are so full of bright ideas on what we can do. And many of them are doing it, often single-handedly. So they're more purpose-driven, the Gen Z and the millennials. And I think it's time to not only give them a seat at the table, in many cases, I actually think it's time to give them the table itself.
Yeah, no, that's really fantastic inspiration, I think, for all of us, and a good, again, very visionary outlook for the future. And I can certainly say actually that I completely recognize also from, as you say, the Maersk perspective as well. You know, we have also had these same experiences actually of the technological development actually going much faster than we had initially anticipated, right? So showing that it actually can be done also in a hard to abate sector. And I think, but you know, how we can as businesses, as different stakeholders within representing different sectors of society, sometimes overcome some of those maybe ingrained ways of thinking, of acting by working together in different partnerships. I think sometimes that is what is needed, right, to bring different sectors together to address those systems changes that need to happen. So if we see, you know, coming back to this question of partnerships and advocacy, what do you see are the main systems changes that need to happen to take us on a net positive journey?
Yeah, I would say companies can do 40 to 50% themselves. Most of that is available already now. Often it's awareness or preconceived notions that get in the way. There's still many CEOs think it is not cheaper to get green energy. In most countries, it is already. There's still many CEOs that think that purpose and profit don't work together, that they work against each other. That's not true anymore. People think that they're too small to make a difference, or that they will never get to these technologies that others might be sitting on. That's not true either. So I think a lot of things can be done already with companies themselves. But then if you want to really solve the tougher issues that we talked about, we all need to work together. And that requires bigger changes. And it is happening at a moment, frankly, Lene, that governments and multilateral institutions are not quite working at the level for which we had designed them. So it is an extra opportunity for business to step up. It's interesting that during the COVID crisis, when we at the same time implemented membership fees, that the UN Global Compact saw its highest increase. We started pre-COVID with 14,000 companies and organizations being part of the Global Compact. Now we have 17,000. It has surprised us all, but people are really jumping on this bandwagon, partly because they see the economic opportunity and want to position it right for the future, their companies. But a lot of them also see that the train has left the station already and don't want to miss the boat. But to really implement at the scale and speed that we need, which is currently missing, we need to broaden systems changes. Obviously, the first one, which I don't need to spend much time on, is total decarbonization of our global economies. And that needs to be better understood. We now have 1/3 of the businesses making science-based targets. We have $37 trillion of money under management wanting to truly decarbonize their portfolios. We have actually 95% of the carbon emissions and 65% of the countries making net zero commitments. But we're not yet moving at the speed and scale, as I said, that is needed. So getting all behind that, holding countries to account, ensuring that we have the right legislation is very important. There is some encouragement with Australia that has changed tax since the elections. India that seems to make an extra contribution to their nationally determined commitments. Another 1 gigaton, it looks like. The US with the IRA, a terrible name, but the Inflation Reduction Act. I hope in Brazil that we will see a change of government and Bolsonaro replaced by whoever that will create momentum. So I think there is momentum happening on the carbon transition. Right. But then the other transitions that we need, without going into too much of the detail, the first one really is the leadership. We are creating the wrong leadership. All these MBA programs in the world are little Milton Friedmans on steroids that come out of it. So how can we, Mette Morsing, who is a fellow Danish person, Mette is the head of the UN Prime, Principles of Responsible Management Education, which is part of the UN Global Compact. 865 universities, more or less, looking at reinventing management education. So that's leadership. It's a big bucket. We could talk about that for an hour. The second system change is not surprising, is we need to treasure what we measure. So if we only measure the return on financial capital, that's what you get. If we also are able to measure the returns on social and environmental capital, there's the whole debate with the Sustainable Standard Board, the single and double materiality that is going on. But at the end of the day, we need to change our accounting system. And some people are already doing that. We have quite a lot of people starting to think what a overall well-being measure would look like versus a simple GDP measure. The third one, barrier that we probably have within all of this is next to redefining GDP, is probably making our multilateral system work again. We have institutions that were designed at Bretton Woods in 1944, and they're frankly not anymore reflecting the realities of the world, and yet the issues are bigger and bigger: climate change, pandemic, cybersecurity, financial markets. So we do need to start to think about a new world order that we all need to be part of, that companies need to participate in. How can we make the WTO function? How can we make the multilateral finance institutions function? And a bigger voice of the private sector in those debates would be very helpful. And then last but not least, and I would want to start with that, but you would probably agree with this, the Sustainable Development Goals have put people back into poverty. It's the one goal where in absolute we're actually slipping back. On climate change, we're not on the trajectory of 1.5 degrees, but the curve is getting better. In inequality, it's actually the wrong way. There's still 3.5 billion people in this world living on less than $5 a day. Now the tragedies of the energy prices or the food prices will push a lot of these people back into poverty. So how can we change our economic system to actually make it more inclusive? How can we drive these enormous changes that we talk about and do that in a just and equitable way? And that ought to be on the agenda of every CEO. Call it the S of ESG, but it's going to be more important in the years to come.
I completely agree. And I think we could spend hours on each of these questions discussing them. But I really want to get to some of the questions that have been brought up by some of the participants on this webinar. So I want to start with a question from Mette Skovbo from Danish Energy Management, which is also asking to from the perspective of SMEs, right, the smaller companies. Now we're talking a lot about taking leadership and being courageous, but her question is actually how do we dare to trust that it pays to go from a focus on economy or finances to a focus on environmental and social responsibility as an SME?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for that question. 90%, 95% of the world is SMEs. I used to chair the International Chamber of Commerce, as you pointed out, and 48 million companies are members of that. The bulk of them are SMEs. SMEs have an advantage, actually. A lot of them, they're closer to the realities of the world, more agile. For Unilever to change to sustainable sourcing, I had to change the world. For SMEs, they can just have their smaller projects and fed in. In fact, a lot of the growth in the economy is coming from SMEs. That's where you also find the disruptors. The top 20 companies now in the world didn't exist in 1990. Tesla would be a great example of an SME that started and now has a market cap bigger than all the other car companies, more or less. So SMEs have a lot of advantages, but I also understand that there are capacity issues that come with it. But ultimately, we will not change the global economy if the SMEs don't change. I think they can have a big impact, not only necessarily in scale, but in what they do. You take food, an industry that I know better, the whole invention of meat alternatives. These are all SMEs that have woken up the bigger companies to start to move. But in fact, most of the industry is still in medium-sized or smaller companies. So they need help. With the ICC, we have a global effort to ensure that trade financing and support will go to the SMEs and that they're not forgotten. With the Global Compact, we have tools to help the SMEs implement. You can go to other trade organizations as well. But then the crunch of the question is, you don't have to do everything. Also for SMEs, if you don't have the financial bandwidth or the people bandwidth, then do it in a few years. So we can do this over the next 10, 20 years. We don't have to all do it tomorrow. But the reality is, even if you're an SME, as I said, 40 to 50% of the things you can do now, and you'd be so much better off for it. We've created some collectives, like for example on fashion, which are all relatively small companies. We have now 76 fashion companies together, including companies like Bestseller from Denmark, for example, with Anders, who is a great leader. And with these companies, we've decided to jointly buy energy. Ørsted would like that. But none of these companies can go individually into the complexities of these new energy contracts. But we have created alliances to have them come together and buy green energy at scale. Increasingly, I think there are more areas that we would call pre-competitive. Yeah. I always say we should not compete on the future of humanity. And green energy buying, for example, is an area where you don't want to compete. So can you aggregate on these tougher challenges? At the end of the day, if there are things that cost you really genuinely more money, if you look at it holistically, and they're not immediately a priority, then put that on a glide path of your strategy 4 or 5 years out.
Great.
Don't forget in all of this that legislation is changing fast. So the level playing field is moving up, if you want to, with the European Green Deal, the taxonomy package and
Yes.
all that stuff. And I've always taken the position, if you're small or big, it's better to make the dust than eat the dust. Try to be ahead of it. So you don't have to worry or be in the constant catching up on legislation, exhausting as it may be, because you're never going to win with that strategy. Try to actually be a leader where you can in the areas that matter.
Right. And then there's a question here where I'd like to come back to. You were also mentioning this a few minutes back on reporting, right, and all the new developments that are happening in that space. So Ida Karbik from Ørsted is asking, how do you view the prospects and need for reporting against a net positive business paradigm? And maybe particularly in that context, how do you see the developments from the ISSB or from the EU and other, is that going to take us to reporting frameworks that will bring us towards net positive, do you think?
Well, as we talked about, our current system of measuring success is deeply flawed and basically only chasing share prices and shareholder value for a few people, if I may say. So I think there's broad consensus in the world that we need to shift to other ways of reporting, and organizations like the Capitals Coalition or the Wellbeing Economy Alliance or the EU's non-financial reporting directive actually go into that direction, including things like the task force of climate-related financial disclosure, or task force on nature-related financial disclosure, or the EU taxonomy, or the IFRS Foundation now that has created the Sustainable Standard Board. So there's a lot happening in that area, including not only the issuing of broader risk guidance and seeking transparency, but also convergence of standards. So that field might look initially a little bit confusing. I don't disagree with that, but that is always the case when things happen and move. 1,000 flowers bloom. Now we have to make a bouquet out of that. What is clear to me, though, in all of this is that with a little bit of research already and the data that's available in the public domain, the financial market is already able to differentiate. I refer to the work that George Sarasan has done in Harvard behind the weighted impact accounts, where they look at 3,500 companies and rank them by industry sector, and where they find in each industry sector consistently that companies, contrary to people's belief, but companies that more aggressively tackle these negative externalities are actually also getting a higher, not lower, market valuation. We've seen the first 2,000 companies that went out of Russia being higher valued relatively to the ones that decided to stay, yet they gave up turnover and profitability. So it does pay increasingly so to internalize, and with Europe being the lead standard setter, in my opinion, we're getting also increasingly the frameworks and the tools to guide us and to ensure that we have a level playing field, which is a concern of many people, that you might be at a disadvantage. So I think, so in net, I'm optimistic, but it needs to happen now much faster than the speed with which some of these bodies are used to work, put it that way.
So I think we have time for one final question, which is an interesting one to close on, I think. So this is Sarah Deljanin from Implement Consulting Group, who's asking, what is the boldest move a company can take to be net positive?
Oh, that's a good question. And it's always dangerous to say there's one move and one magic wand, because it's a little bit more complex than that. I would say three things, if I may, very briefly. is first and foremost take responsibility of your total impact in the world, not just your handprint or footprint, but your total blueprint. There are many companies, still too many companies, that don't get into scope 3, yet most of their emissions are there. So that's why I applaud and recognize Maersk at the beginning. But you need to take responsibility of your total impact. It starts there. If the leadership doesn't do it, it won't get there. The second thing is to set targets in line with science. That takes courage, makes you feel uncomfortable. But many people are used to, targets I need to hit, otherwise I get fired. No, if targets don't make you feel uncomfortable, or if you already have all the answers, then these targets aren't good enough yet. So you really have to set ambitious targets next to taking responsibility of your total impact. And the third one, which takes equally courage, is to work in these broader partnerships and embrace these partnerships and be part of that. This is not a spectator's game anymore. We're really at a very serious point for humanity, and we need all of us around the table there, even if it makes a little bit of giving. And that's why we call it how courageous companies thrive by giving more than they take, because courageous companies are made up of courageous leaders. And courage starts with the French word cœur, which is heart. Anything that goes to the heart will stick in the brain, but if it's just going in and out of the brain, it doesn't mean anything. It takes courage to take total responsibility. It takes courage to set targets that we need. It takes courage to work together with others and sometimes hear the inconvenient truths, or having to take other people's concerns into account. But ultimately, what we've already seen in COVID as well, where there was a bifurcation between companies run with the multi-stakeholder longer-term view versus shareholder primacy, we've also seen a bifurcation in leadership, where leaders that operate with a higher level of empathy, compassion, embrace partnerships, think multi-generational, are systemic thinkers. These leaders are more courageous. They instill a higher level of trust in a very uncertain time, and they create a following. And that's the type of courage that we now need in each and every company. So it does start and end with ourselves. It's not anything more than that.
All right, thank you so much, Paul. I think that was an excellent answer, and certainly, thank you so much for giving us absolutely this call to action, to dare to be uncomfortable and take take actions with courage going forward. So I want to thank you so much and for being with us today, and thank you also to the participants for raising some good questions. And also just want to finally remind people that if you go to the globalcompact.dk website/events, you can find an overview of future events also in the local network here in Denmark. So thank you so much for the excellent talk today, Paul. We really enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed it personally as well. And have an excellent rest of the day to everyone.
Thanks, Lene, and thanks for all what you're doing. And if any of the companies want to reach out, don't hesitate. We've talked to about 200 companies and can go a little bit more into detail. But first and foremost, thanks for what you're all doing for the UN Global Compact, but above all, for humanity. Highly appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Be safe.